Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Colin Jamron. He's a friend of mine from New York University. He is a licensed mental health professional. He's been working in the field for 10 years, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation about mental health, men, Jewish community and mental health, and a few other things I'm very interested in exploring with Colin. Hi, Colin.
Hey, Omar, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Colin, can you first say a bit about your practice, where you're situated, what exactly do you do?
Sure. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I run a practice called Jamron Counseling. We're located mostly in Brooklyn, New York. We do have four locations total, three of which are in Brooklyn, and one is in Long Island, so nearby, but not exactly in the city. And basically, what we do is set out to provide affordable, accessible, quality care to people who are seeking out therapy. We work with all kinds of diagnoses. So we're talking, anxiety, depression, a lot of adjustment disorders. You find a lot of people that live in New York City or come to New York City deal with, the big adjustment that comes with that. And people are, seeking ways to talk about that, to juggle the different responsibilities that they have. And so we work with all kinds of people to help them, work through different kinds of
Mhm.
issues and, find their way forward.
Yeah. All right. Colin, the first thing I want to explore with you is I know that you come from a Jewish background. Your Jewish identity is very important to you. You've also been through Jewish educational systems. So help me understand your own journey through your religious identity and how that interacted with your counseling education. Have there been any conflicts, or has your religious identity reinforced your work? Tell us about that,
Mm,
please.
sure, yeah. So I grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community called Chabad Lubavitch. This was in a school in Massachusetts where I grew up. Their headquarters is actually based in Brooklyn, New York, which is funny enough how I ended up in New York because of my association with that religious sect. So growing up in the ultra-Orthodox world, you basically, depending on what school you go to, you split your time between, some secular studies, but the vast majority of what you're learning is actually Judaic studies. So we're talking about like Bible study, we're talking about Talmud, which is more like analytical discussions around Jewish law and Jewish concepts. There's certain, mysticism aspects that you'll learn about as well. It's a wide range of things that you learn growing up. Um, and in my opinion, I think it actually fits rather well with going into the field of psychology and going into the field of mental health. Um, and there's a few ways that I could really break that down. So one of the ways
Mhm.
that I would look at that from is that in in Judaism, it can be seen as sort of well, depending on your perspective, it can be seen as a flexible kind of religion. So our attitudes towards things have changed over time as new information comes about. I'll give an example.
Mhm.
So, for example, in Judaism, suicide is forbidden. It's a forbidden act, and it's something that is treated very seriously. In that a Jewish person who commits suicide, traditionally speaking, is not allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery.
Mhm.
That being said, now that our understanding of psychology and mental health concerns has advanced over the years, now we understand, oh, well, if someone commits suicide, they might be acting out of a sense of desperation. They might be acting out of a sense of depression or stress or something that makes them feel that suicide is the only option. And in that moment, that might be their decision. So most modern forms of Judaism will then look at that and say, oh, well, if someone is not in the right frame of mind to be making, certain kinds of decisions, then you know what, maybe we don't need to penalize that. Maybe that means something different than we originally thought that it was going to mean. So I think Judaism can be flexible in some regards, like the example I just gave, but it can also be a little inflexible, especially among the ultra orthodox, where it's very insular. And so there's a lot of effort that's put to keeping the community isolated, really, is the best word to put it. So those communities will often, restrict access to the internet, for example. You need rabbinical permission in certain communities to access the internet, to have an email address, to even have a smartphone,
Mhm.
are some things that are restricted. So that can make access to mental health difficult because,
Mm.
you're taught to, rely on your rabbinical leaders, for example, for guidance. So if you're struggling with something, it's, oh, well, talk to your rabbi, talk to your family, talk to the elders in the community. They'll guide you through it. But as we know, some issues in mental health, require a higher level of care, and it can be hard to seek that out when you're taught this insular view, and you don't even necessarily have the means to know how to even go out and find a therapist. So it can be very varied depending on what
Mm.
community we're talking.
And that's very interesting. Over the years, we've always talked about similarities between Islam and Judaism. How a lot of these practices, a lot of these, even this sense of this guilt might be something that people carry along. Just like you were saying, that the prescription for mental health in some religious communities might be just to express that gratitude, or just to pray, or just to sort of connect with your family. And there's a lot of shame and a taboo in taking these things to a counselor, especially a secular counselor. So help me understand what are some of those issues that are mental health concerns that are faced within the Jewish community, which probably as an insider you might have a lot more insight about.
Mm. Yeah, I think fitting in can be a major source of stress for people in the community.
Mm,
There's a lot of norms, there's a lot of expectations of a person in the Jewish communities, again, especially in the ultra Orthodox world. I mean, we're talking, children in those communities, I'm not sure exactly what age, but maybe around, say, 7 or 8 years old. They might be in school for, 8, 10 hours in a day,
mm,
learning mostly Judaic studies, in some cases only Judaic studies.
mm,
Many of these children growing up either have a poor sense of English or don't even know how to speak English at all.
mm,
Um, and so it can be very challenging growing up, because if you fit in, that's great. Because if you fit in, you'll get support from the community. You'll have people who will look after you. They'll help you find a job. They'll set you up with someone to marry and to have kids and to
mm,
follow the guidelines of the community. But if you don't fit in, and you experience something else, for example, people in the LGBTQ community, in the ultra Orthodox world, or even in the Orthodox world, can really struggle to fit in. And there's not really many places for them to talk about those kinds of issues. So it can be really challenging from an adjustment perspective. And, furthermore, if you're dealing with things like anxiety, panic, depression, those sorts of things, as you were just mentioning
mm,
before, the answer to that is oftentimes, well, you need to, rededicate yourself to serving God, or you need to pray more, or you need to, reinvest in the community. Um, and for those who don't fit the mold, it can be very challenging.
But then you also understand as a counselor how some of those things might be very shame inducing. So if you're receiving a client like this, how are you working with them?
So the first step is to try to understand their frame of mind. They're coming
Mm,
from a very different background. So, as we're taught in the therapy community, it's like when someone comes to you and says, oh, I'm feeling depressed, right?
mm,
I might know for myself what feeling depressed is like, but I don't necessarily know what being depressed is like for you. So I would need you to
mm,
explain that to me. So similarly, when someone comes from, the Jewish community or an Orthodox background, despite what I might think I would know,
mm,
it's important to ask those questions and to give time and space for the person to be able to really express where they're coming from, how they see the world, because they might have
mm,
very, very different perspectives on things. They might
mm,
they might feel shame, as I mentioned
mm,
before, in using a cell phone or seeing a
mm,
therapist.
mm,
So something that I might think, oh, well, a cell phone, that's not that big of a deal. But
mm.
for someone coming from the type of background like that, that could be a very big deal. So I think the first thing to remember going into that is to really try to understand the frame of mind and the perspective, the vantage point that the person is demonstrating to you when they come in.
Mhm. That's so wonderful. And just a reminder of that universality of our skill set in some ways, which is that you don't really need to know the other person, but you need to just suspend your judgment and give them that open, unconditional space where they can have that non-shaming space for them to explore what they're feeling and for us to help them through that. Colin, another thing I want to know about your work, I know that in the recent years, as a male therapist, that's a very, whether that's in New York or whether that's in anywhere in the world. I mean, we even in our class in NYU, we probably had 6 or 8 men in the class of 60 or 70 people. So over the years, I know that you've been working a lot with male clients. So can you say a bit more about your work with men?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, and again, I can't speak more generally, but in my experience, I
Mm,
find that men tend to prefer working with male therapists. The vast
mhm,
majority of my caseload, traditionally speaking, and currently, is of men. And I think that there's various components about what goes into that. I think that there are, concepts around masculinity or even toxic masculinity might be playing a role in terms of, men reaching out to talk about their feelings, to talk about what's going on. And I think it can even approach levels of shame. Men might
mm,
experience shame saying, "Hey, I'm struggling with something that I maybe was taught, in some shape or form. Maybe I was taught to, tough it up, to man up, these phrases that we hear, that men hear oftentimes growing up. It can be tough to say, you know what, I think that there's something going on here that I need to talk more about. And so
mm,
I suspect that for men, it might feel a little bit easier and a little less shame inducing to talk to another man who might be able to understand that perspective, who might
mm,
be able to
mm,
say, you know what, I know what that's like. I also know what that's like to
mm,
grow up hearing that I should just, swallow my feelings and
mm,
not express myself in certain ways. Um, and to hear it from a male therapist to be able to say it's okay what you're going through. It's
mm,
natural, it's normal, it's healthy to express yourself, and that we can work through these issues together. And there doesn't have to, we don't have to feel shameful about it. We can explore the shame, but we
mm,
don't necessarily have to feel any one particular way about
mm. Absolutely. And I'm imagining that's such a special space for a man, especially to have with another man, because I'm imagining that in all other contexts, that rarely is the case where you can share safely with another man how you're feeling or what your experience of something is, and they're holding that space for you. They're providing that sense of belongingness where you can say all of that. So it's such a special space that as a male therapist you're able to create for other men. Would you? Whereas I'm also thinking that in terms of skill set, maybe a male and a female therapist are both meant to maybe provide the non-judgmental space. They're both meant to not shame a client, but somehow it seems like that for a male, it's also their expectation that they're bringing in
it.
what they can say to you or what they can say to maybe a female therapist.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a very interesting dynamic because, as you're
Mm,
pointing out, I'm trained similar to the way a female therapist would be trained.
mm,
And so, at the core of it, we might be coming from similar approaches. But, at the same time, I think that we know that, you know, reflecting on our own backgrounds, where we come from, our own experiences, we don't
mm,
want to necessarily shove that into the therapy moment, right? We want to be able to
mm,
hold back and have a proper space and, and allow the client to really express what's going on without, my own baggage coming in with it. At the same time, I think that, having gone through some of the same experiences, it might enable us to understand or to empathize in a way that's different, in a
mm,
similar way that we need to respect the fact that there are, you know, differences, there might be differences between men and women, that there's going to be
mm,
cultural differences. There's going to be, differences in terms of how people are raised and how different cultures approach different problems and how they perceive the events in their lives. And
mm,
so all of that becomes really relevant when we talk about these sorts of things. So going back to the idea of, men working with a male therapist, it I think that it enables us to see things from a different perspective that might
mm.
that might not exist in other spaces.
Okay. All right. Last question for you, Colin. I know that during the pandemic, all of our work shifted, and now we're slowly going back to face work. How do you see that entire space? Therapy in the digital age, has that become more isolated? What does it mean for you to go back to the face-to-face counseling? How do you see that?
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right when you use the word isolated or isolating.
Mm,
Um, I think that the field of therapy in general can be isolating, whether we're talking about telehealth or in person. When you think about it, we're in our offices, we're seeing the clients that we're working with, for long periods of time or throughout the day. We have busy days. It's not always easy to connect and collaborate with our colleagues. things. And I think that that problem has been exacerbated, following or through the pandemic, where now so much is done via telehealth. When you think about the fact that sessions are now largely done over telehealth, I guess it depends on the practice, but in a lot of cases, I think that's still true. Um, and even when you talk about things like doing trainings or attending seminars, now so much of it is online, which just takes away from some of that experience. So I do think it can be isolating. I do think that it kind of forces us or encourages us to be a bit more deliberate in seeking out our colleagues, seeking out training, seeking out opportunities to connect and work with others in those cases. And for when we're able to see our clients in person, I think that that can be uh, I think it can be a very important shift in
Mm,
terms of working with people, just because, as many therapists might be able to connect with, it's just a different experience when you're
yeah.
working in person. You're picking up on the mannerisms and the seating and how the client walks through the door and just,
Mm.
all of those elements that come together. I think it really can really change things. So I think that, whereas that might not always be possible, I think it's important for us to seek out opportunities to connect with others in whatever shape that might take.
Absolutely, I agree. In the last year, I've probably only worked 20 days in person, in contrast to most of the rest of the year online. And I agree. Obviously, the quality of the work that is done in person and what it is behind a screen, it's different. All right. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Colin. This has been very rich and very insightful, especially your experience working with men, your own working within the Jewish community. It's been very insightful knowing some of those things. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you.